When we hear of extreme weather events, we often think of the physical damage such as people's homes being destroyed, buildings collapsing, and the physical injuries or fatalities, but we often overlook the mental health impacts that people face as a result of exposure to these extreme weather events. Extreme weather events caused by climate change have significant impacts on mental health. So, what do we mean by climate change? In general, climate change can be defined as changes in climate characteristics over long time periods. We know that the planet is warming. By 2016, the planet has already warmed 1 degree Celsius compared to pre-industrial temperatures due to greenhouse gas emissions. If we continue operating business as usual, we can expect a warming of nearly 3 degrees Celsius, which would have devastating consequences for many parts of the world. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense due to climate change. This is due to increased temperature and increased evaporation, leading to more severe droughts and more intense storms. Extreme weather events include floods, wildfires, droughts, heat waves, etc. Shown on the left is a flood in central Texas, and on the right is a wildfire in central California. As a result of these events, people can lose their home, be disconnected from family members or close ones, lose their possessions, have limited access to resources, among many other factors, and these all have strong psychological implications. I'd like to talk about the most common mental health effects faced following extreme weather events. The most common effect is post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be defined as a sense of intense fear, which is triggered by memories of a past event and anticipating that another traumatic event may occur. Other symptoms of PTSD can include feelings of isolation as well as emotional numbing. And importantly, women are more than twice as likely to develop PTSD than men. Another common effect is anxiety. And anxiety can be defined as a feeling of apprehension and tension due to the anticipation of a dangerous or undesirable event. This is generally accompanied by worried thoughts and also physical changes like increased blood pressure. And finally, depression. Depression can be defined as feelings of sadness and a loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities. Depression can significantly impair one's ability to function at work and at home. I'd now like to walk through a specific case study, specifically the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfires. And this was the costliest natural disaster in Alberta, Canada's history, and it was a 1.5 million acre fire which burned more than 2,400 homes and caused a displacement of roughly 88,000 people. This was also the largest evacuation in Alberta, Canada's history. I'd now like to walk through a study which conducted clinical interviews to determine mental health effects of residents and those affected by the Fort McMurray wildfires. In this study, 55 evacuees aged 18 and older were interviewed, and there was an equal distribution of male and female with a mean age of 43 years. As can be seen by the chart here, there were significant cases of PTSD, major depression disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and insomnia disorder. The rates for each were 29% for post-traumatic stress disorder, 25% for major depression disorder, 24% for generalized anxiety disorder, and 44% for insomnia disorder. This really illustrates the significant mental health effects of residents following extreme weather events. I'd next like to walk through two studies which show the long-term mental health effects following the Fort McMurray wildfires, which illustrate the effects 6 months and 18 months following the wildfire. After 6 months, surveys were distributed to 486 adults, and these surveys included the PTSD checklist, which was used to determine likely PTSD in respondents, and those with a PCL-5 score of 33 or more, which is basically a measure to determine PTSD symptomology were considered to have likely PTSD. The prevalence rate for PTSD was 12.8%, and it was significantly higher in females at 14.9% compared to 8.7% in males. Females were also twice as likely to receive mental health counseling following the event, and this is compared at 8% to males and 17% females. Respondents with likely PTSD were also more likely to report increased drug use, though interestingly, increased alcohol use was not reported. After 18 months following the wildfire, 290 adult respondents were interviewed, and they were given a survey to determine likely PTSD, major depression disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. There was a 13.6% prevalence for likely post-traumatic stress disorder. This is an increase compared to after 6 months by a little less than 1%. There was also a 24.8% prevalence for likely major depression disorder, as well as an 18% prevalence for likely generalized anxiety disorder. There was also 15% reported hazardous drinking and 9.1% reported drug use. There are some predictors of elevated PTSD symptoms, such as those with a history of generalized anxiety disorder were about 6 times more likely to show PTSD symptoms 18 months after the disaster. Respondents aged 41 years and older were about 2 times as likely to show major depression disorder 18 months after the wildfires, as well as those witnessing homes burning. Those with history of major depressive disorder were 4 times as likely to show symptoms, and those who reported low levels of support from family and friends were about 2.5 times as likely to show major depression disorder symptoms. Elevated generalized anxiety disorder symptoms were predicted by those respondents who reported being fearful for their lives or the lives of family and friends, in which they were about 3.5 times as likely to be present with generalized anxiety disorder 18 months after the wildfires. Respondents with a history of depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder were about 3 and 2.5 times likely to develop generalized anxiety disorder. I'd also like to note that the 12.8% prevalence for likely PTSD is an extreme increase of about 6 times compared to the average Canadian rate of roughly 2%. I'd now like to discuss another extreme weather event, Hurricane Katrina, which was a devastating hurricane which struck the southeastern region of the U.S. in August of 2015. This hurricane was categorized as a Category 5 hurricane, and it led to this displacement of more than 1 million people, and more than 850,000 housing units were damaged. Also, about 300,000 vehicles were destroyed, as well as thousands of ships and vessels. I'd now like to walk through a study which demonstrates the mental health effects following Hurricane Katrina. This study focused on effects 6 and 18 months following the event, and 815 residents of affected areas were interviewed. And they were interviewed using the trauma screening questionnaire of PTSD and the K6 screening scale of anxiety mood disorders. These were used to create prevalence estimates for the disorders. The prevalence for 6 months for anxiety mood disorder was 30.7% and 33.9% for the follow-up survey 1 year later. Please note that the first percentage indicates the prevalence rate 6 months after the hurricane, and the second percentage indicates prevalence rates 18 months after the hurricane. The prevalence rates for serious mental illness were 10.9% in the initial interview and 14% in the follow-up interview. The prevalence rates for PTSD were 11.8% in the initial interview and 20% in the follow-up interview, showing quite a large increase compared to the others. Suicide ideation was recorded at 2.8% 6 months after the hurricane and 6.4% 18 months after the hurricane. And suicide plans were following a similar trend at 1% 6 months after the hurricane and 2.5% 18 months after the hurricane. It's important to note that it's not only those who are actively affected by a climate event that can suffer psychological damage. Eco-anxiety has been defined as a chronic fear of environmental doom, and mental health professionals are observing more and more people being affected by eco-anxiety. One of the main factors which contributes to eco-anxiety is knowing that a dangerous disaster is impending and not having the proper tools or resources to mitigate the threat. The overwhelming threat of an environmentally uncertain future propels eco-anxiety and increases emotional distress caused by environmental change. It is thought that young individuals from high-income countries are especially vulnerable to effects of eco-anxiety. Also, individuals in low and middle-income countries are generally least able to deal with the mental health effects brought about by climate change, and are also the ones least responsible for climate change. Now, what are some ways that we can address the mental health issues moving forward? One of them is conducting more in-depth research on climate change and mental health and better understanding the link between the two. Also developing a more holistic view of health, which includes mental health, and further including mental health indicators in the climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessments. It is also important that emergency mental health services are a part of disaster emergency services so that mental health is available to those who need it following extreme weather events. The greater monitoring and documentation of mental health trends following disasters will be able to allow health professionals and communities to better prepare in terms of mental health services for future events, as well as maintaining strong support networks among family and friends to increase your resistance against mental health effects. Thank you.